Hello, welcome back to Sterling Armory's Oakeshott Typology series. We're going back to Group 1, and we are looking at Type XI, Type 11. And we've done a few, so we finished all of the Group 2 in Oakeshott Typology, which is the blades that I typically prefer to like to make. But we do occasionally make blades down in Group 1. In fact, the more I dive into them, the more I want to make them. We've already done Group X, Group 10, and then we did Type 10, Type X, and then we did Type 12 as well. So now we are those are the only two that we've done in Group 1. So now we're going to be finishing that not finishing that, but continuing that with Group 11. Now, the neat thing, I guess, let me caveat everything. So if you're new to the channel here and you're new to the Oakeshott Typology, if you want to know a bit more information about it, the typology in general, I would highly recommend going back to the first video in the series, and then kind of going from there. So we go off of two books, so Sword in the Age of Chivalry and Records of the Medieval Sword. And with Type 11 that we're going to be doing today, there is, again, a bit of changes. So in his original book, and I'll go through the typology in his description of the Type 11 in a second, but in his original book, when he first came out, he had Type 11, Type 11A, and then Type 11B. And then Type 11B, he realized, well, they're not really a separate subtype because they found a lot of blades that were kind of corroded. So those actually, when you look at them and what they really are, if you ignore the corrosion, they fit back into the general Type 11. And so when you come to the second book in Records of the Medieval Sword, he actually talks about that directly. He says, I made a mistake in the first book, so there's only 11 and then 11A. Okay, so with that in mind, let's actually just cover briefly what he classifies as Type 11. And the neat thing so I think Oakeshott really liked the older blade types. So everything in Group 1, I think he really preferred. So when you look at Sword in the Age of Chivalry, there's a lot of writing and a lot of detail about Group 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. There's a lot of writing in here about it. And so he goes into a lot of descriptions, a lot of his personal characteristics and what he's found in the types and why he split the different types off. And then when you get to the later types, those descriptions and stuff start getting shorter and shorter and shorter, to the point where Group 20 only has a page. Whereas, here I'm looking at Group 11, it's going on, 7-8 pages here. So the earlier the groups are, I think the more interested Oakeshott himself was in the actual material. So real quick, and again, just as a brief description, so basically what Oakeshott's doing with the typology here is he's trying to classify blades and their evolution throughout history. And the typology somewhat captures that, but it's not always accurate, right? So for example, we have a Type 10, Type XA, that he thought was dated much earlier, but it turns out it's in the 1300s. So it doesn't really follow the date or chronological order, but it's still a good general description of blade types. So what is a Type 11? So real quick, if you're familiar if we go back and watch Type 10, Type 10s were pretty much the Anglo-Saxon Viking type blades with very wide flat blades with very wide fullers. So Type 10 is kind of the next step after that, and he says, to read his writings here, it's a long, narrow blade, sharply contrasting with the broad, short blades of the Type 10, or Type X. The edges run parallel for about 2/3 the blade length, and then taper into subtle curves to an adequate point. The fuller is narrow, very narrow, and often very shallow and poorly defined, and it runs pretty much the length of the blade. He says 4/5, but that changes later. And so basically the Type 11 blades are... they look like Type X blades, but they're longer, they're narrower, and that fuller is really thin down the edge. I'm going to jump to the other book to describe Type 11A here. And again, Type 11B was a subtype he had in that original book that he later changed. So when he goes in and defines it in our records book, he says, let me jump to it here. So actually, I'm going to read his entire thing here because I think it's kind of neat. So again, he's much more detailed in his earlier sword types. So he says for type 11 here in type 11A, this is distinguishing by having a slender blade, generally long in proportion to the hilt. So these 11s are much longer than type 10s were. Like sometimes 8, 10 to 11 inches longer. So they're quite long blades for their grips. They're generally long in proportion to their hilt. They have a very narrow fuller running to within a few inches of the point. And the classic examples have very little taper on the edges, though in well-preserved examples, they have adequate points. So when he gets to type A, so however, for the type 11A, the blade is broader like the type 10 and shorter like the type 10, but it still has that narrow fuller. So basically you have two types in type 11. You have the really long, really narrow blades with a very narrow fuller. And then 11A is the very wider, the wide blade with still having a very narrow fuller going to the end. And also as an FYI, so he talks about this a bit in both books as well, but let's jump to some images here. So if you think back to, if you're familiar with Viking and Saxon blades, anything in the Viking era, there's a lot of blades from that time period and a little bit later to the early medieval period where there's the brazelnut pommels, the flat guards that are rectangular, and then the blades, long, narrow blades. Those are mostly all type 11s. So a lot of type 11s have that brazelnut pommel. So yeah, let's go ahead and dive into some images here. Before I go any further, let me remind you. So again, we have one more weekend of the Sarasota Medieval Fair. I forgot I had this image in here. So if you are at Sarasota Medieval Fair this weekend, this will be Thanksgiving weekend, so the weekend right after Thanksgiving. Please come out and join us. Last weekend we had a lot of people come out. It was great. We're doing quite well. The show's doing quite well. Our friends Corey and Shai at Raven Leathers have a booth right next to us. They're doing quite well, and their armor is beautiful. So if you can swing by and come grab some meat and hang out with us and play with swords, it's always a good time. And again, thanks to those who came by who said they're watching our series and they're watching our channel and they're on our Facebook page. It's awesome to hear that, and that's what keeps me going here. So it's been good. So to the type 11s now. So here's real quick. So if we look at the upper left, my picture's kind of in the way. I don't know if I can move that. No, it doesn't look like it. But you'll see the long, narrow blade on the far left there with the brazelnut pommel and that flat cross guard. And you'll see the one on the far right. It's kind of the same thing. These are both images out of his examples, out of records. And then the other two there are the same blade shape, but a lot of these also have flat disc pommels as well. I believe the brazelnut pommel is a bit more common, but they do have some that have round disc pommels that are flat with that same very rectangular crossguard. So you can see how narrow that fuller is. And again, the fuller is not well defined. There is one note in his original book. There's always that argument of where do fullers start? Do they start in the tang or do they start down on the blade? And type 11s are the one type where, at least I'm pretty sure it's the one type, where there's a lot of examples where the fuller starts on the blade, doesn't start in the tang. And that's not common on most medieval swords, right? Most medieval swords, your fuller is going to run all the way through the tang, or into the tang, sorry. And on type 11s, there's a couple, and I believe that second one in, well, no, not the second one in. Actually, I don't know if he has one. But there are a few, and he talks about it, where the tang or the fuller doesn't go into the tang. And that's, for some reason, more common on type 11s. My guess is because a lot of the type 11s, the fuller is very poorly defined, and that could be due to corrosion. I'm not sure. But yeah, there are a couple of them where the fuller does not go into the tang. So for those of you who know that whole discussion and whole argument, so there's that. Okay, so that's type 11. So when we look at the type 11A, I only got one example there. So again, if you were to look at that without seeing the fuller, if you just look at the outline, you probably think that's a type 10. Well, what separates that from a type 10 is that the fuller there, instead of being wide like the type 10, that's a very narrow fuller running down there. So yeah, so that's it. So let's cover that. So again, the type 11 blades, it was just a quick summary. This is a short video today. The Type 11 blades, if you like reading about historical pieces, and especially the inscriptions and how they are able to identify a lot of these pieces and the time periods they're identified on, I highly recommend diving into his source material from Swords in the Age of Chivalry, because he writes a lot about Type 10s, 11s, and 12s, and 13s. And so, yeah, he's got 7 pages on this. So I highly recommend diving in if you want to read about all that stuff. But yeah, that's in general the Type 11. So I hope that helps with defining what the Type 11 is. In terms of, I didn't talk about taper and distal taper yet. So Type 10s and Type 11s, their distal taper is kind of all over the map. You can have some that have a 50% distal taperish. You can have some that have almost no distal taper, but those are generally very thin throughout their whole blade. So these blades, although very long, are usually very light and very flexible. So yeah, that's a Type 11. So I'm definitely going to be making some of these pretty soon. Actually, I have a couple of these designs in my head, especially the brazen nut pommel. I've been wanting to do that for a while. So if you have any questions on any of that, please let us know. Please comment and like and share the video to help out the new channel. And yeah, we're excited to get these. So this is the first one or second one back since we were having my laptop crash. And so we'll be finishing off group 1. So next one up, we did Type 12 already. So we'll be doing 13 and 14. And then we go into guard types and pommel types and grip types and all that stuff. So thanks for joining us if you're still with us. And we will catch you guys next time. Thanks.